In this lecture, we'll be looking at the High Renaissance. Dates of the High Renaissance are roughly about 1485 to 1527. However, you note once we move into items from the Northern Renaissance that these dates are actually a little later. The date 1527 is often given for the end of the High Renaissance because that is when Rome was actually sacked by outside forces. One of the main changes from the early Renaissance to the High Renaissance was the Protestant Reformation in 1517. This was led by Martin Luther, who was challenging the authority of the Catholic Church. Luther sought to reform what he saw were certain members of the clergy taking advantage of people, especially with the idea of indulgences. What the idea of buying indulgence were, if you sinned, you were supposed to go to church and you were supposed to confess. And then whoever you confessed to would give you certain penance that you would need to do, whether activities or saying prayers. Well, a practice developed where people could simply buy their forgiveness. As you can probably imagine, this led to some in the church taking advantage of this, and those with a lot of money being able to commit whatever sins they wanted and then simply go and pay for forgiveness. Luther did not think this was correct, and it was not following the true scripture of the church. In 1517, he posted his 95 Theses on the doors of the Wittenberg Cathedral. Here they were 95 different points that he thought the church needed to address. And many people followed Luther, and this caused one of the greatest splits within the church, forming the Protestant religion. Luther also challenged the authority of the Pope. At this time, the Pope, who is the leader of the church, was seen as the voice of God, that when the Pope spoke, what he said was as if God itself was speaking. However, Luther said this is not correct, and he again returned to the scripture and said the Pope is a man. He is a man on earth. Therefore, if he's a man, he is fallible. God is infallible. The Pope cannot be the voice of God. The Pope is simply the leader of the Catholic Church. The church responded to the Protestant Reformation by trying to bring people back into the church, mainly through a large art building program. This is where we're going to see the church, the popes, calling most of the great artists to Rome. And this is why in the High Renaissance we see a shift from Florence to Rome. Here, the church, or more specifically the popes, called the great artists of the time to Rome to complete what we now call the Vatican. As you can see in the image here, this is St. Peter's Basilica. You can see the dome. The dome was actually finished by Michelangelo. And the image on the right-hand side in the lower is inside the St. Peter's looking up into the dome itself. Michelangelo was not the original architect of the St. Peter's, but after the original architect had been fired, others had moved on, Michelangelo actually criticized the plans. He was then put in charge. Interestingly enough, he looked back at the original plans and said there's nothing wrong with them. He claimed they were clear and pure and full of light. And so what he did was he actually went back to the original architects. Also, looking up at the interior dome, this was also designed by Michelangelo. St. Peter's Basilica was completed in May of 1590, but completion of the square, which you can see in these images, was not done until 1614. Again, this was all part of a plan to bring people back to the church. Pope Sixtus IV commissioned the Sistine Chapel, which he named after himself. First we had frescoes that were painted by Perugino and Botticelli, and then we very famously have the ceiling and the Last Judgment painted by Michelangelo. We will look at these later in the lecture. The High Renaissance was considered the high point in Renaissance art. Again, we see the return to classical ideals, especially the Greek ideal of an idealized form. However, Renaissance artists sought to capture the ideals of classic art, but not just copy them. Whereas in ancient Greek works, the idealized forms were found through showing the most perfect form. So if we were looking at a sculpture of, say, the discus thrower, It wouldn't be an individual who we would know who they are, like we wouldn't know it was LeBron, but we would just know this as the ideal form of man. In Renaissance art, we would know who the individual is. And how the idealized forms in the Renaissance were shown were through mathematical means that defined composition and proportions. The belief was in a harmonious universe that was found in perfect order, and that composition of works was arranged according to this mathematical order, and composition was closed, meaning it draws our eye into the work. An example of this can be seen here in Raphael's Alba Madonna. It was painted in 1510, and it was an oil transferred from wood to canvas. Here we see Mary with a baby Jesus and a young John the Baptist. Within this work, you can see that, again, of course, the circle is cut that way intentionally, but we see a strong equilateral triangle in the composition. If you start at Mary's head, follow the line down from her arm to the ground, cut across, and then go back up the back of John the Baptist to top of Mary's head, you get an equilateral triangle. Again, showing this harmony through the mathematical ideals. This was also a time of continued discovery. Nicolas Copernicus, his dates 1473 to 1543, wrote on the revolutions of celestial bodies. This was published in 1543, the year of his death. And what he did in this work is he claimed that the Earth and the other planets revolved around the sun. You have to remember at this time we're still living in a geocentric universe, meaning the belief was that the Earth was the center of the universe and everything else revolved around it. And this was an idea that was championed by the church. However, Copernicus, through mathematicals and scientific discovery, said, no, this is not true, and we actually live in a heliocentric universe, meaning the sun is the center, and everything else revolves around it. The church defied this and denied its claim and said that this would not be true, because if this was true, it would mean that the teachings of the church, which was supposedly the ideals put out by God, was incorrect. In fact, in 1606, On the Revolutions of Celestial Bodies was still on the index of prohibited books. Another invention at the time was the scientific method. This was created by Francis Bacon, 1562 to 1626. And what he claimed was that you needed actual scientific observations. That when hypotheses were made, that instead of just relying on blind faith, that one must go out and test and prove whether their hypothesis is accurate or not. Now let's go ahead and turn our attention to the artwork of the time. We're going to start with painting, and we're going to look at the first of what are considered the three great Florentine artists. This includes Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo. The image you're looking at here is probably one you're very familiar with. This is The Last Supper, 1495 to 1498. It's tempera and oil on plaster. It is a fresco, located in the Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan, Italy. Leonardo da Vinci was a very well-respected artist of the time. He is most known as a painter, but he was a well-educated individual. And while many people respected him, one of his flaws was that he often abandoned projects for newer ones. Why? Because he just had too many ideas. Da Vinci was an inventor. When we go back and we look at his notebooks, we can see drawings for things such as an idea for a helicopter. So he would just have too many ideas going on in his head, and he would abandon one project for a new one. However, within The Last Supper here, we can see some of these elements of the High Renaissance. We are still looking at a very biblical scene. This is the moment where Jesus has just announced that one of the apostles will betray him. So obviously it's a moment full of tension, full of emotion. Da Vinci is using his elements and principles of composition to help focus the work. If you look at the perspective that is used, the building creates linear perspective. The vanishing point ends right about Jesus' head. Jesus is the figure in the center of the work. And so your eyes are drawn into the work. Also, in the background, you can see above the central window, there is an arch. This almost serves as a halo above his head. And then the windows themselves, that we have the larger central window where Jesus is almost framed within the image. The lighter background again makes him the central focal point within the work. Also, within this, Jesus is not the only focal point. He is the most important one, but we have, as we look at the different apostles along the table, we can see four different focal points. The apostles are all broken into groups of three. All of them, in some way, are referencing Jesus, whether they're looking at him or gesturing towards him. Da Vinci said the most challenging aspect of this work was actually capturing the emotion on Christ's face and on Judas' face. Remember, this is the moment where Jesus has just announced one of the apostles will betray him. Judas is the apostle who does, according to the tale, does eventually betray him. And Judas is in the group immediately to Jesus' right. So as you're looking at it, it's immediately to the left of Jesus. And he's actually looking away from Jesus, but in his right hand you can see he's holding a money bag, which alludes to the idea that he's holding the 30 pieces of silver he was paid to betray Christ. Next, we're going to look at works by Raphael, the second of the great Florentine artists. Raphael was born in 1483 and he died in 1520. Sadly, he died very young. We just refer to him as Raphael, but he was Raphael Santi of Urbino. And he became very famous for his paintings of the Madonna and Child, three of which you can see here. The one in the upper right we've already looked at. This is the Alba Madonna. The one on the bottom right is the Madonna of the Meadows, 1505, oil on panel. This is the one in your book. And then the larger figure on the left is the Madonna of the Goldfinch, 1505 to 06, and it is an oil on wood. What is interesting in these works is we still have very, very biblical scenes here. We have Mary with the baby Jesus and then the young infant of John the Baptist. So within these works, it's a highly religious work. However, this Mary seems much more approachable. She seems more of a mother figure instead of a holy figure. You can even look at the flesh tones. This looks as if it's very realistic within the work. It looks as if this is a scene you could stumble upon as you were walking in a field. And so here we have Raphael blending the sacred and the secular together. The images become almost more about the mother and the children and not concerned with the iconography, making them much more relatable. However, you can also see, as we earlier discussed, they still have that mathematical harmony that was wanted in the High Renaissance. In 1508, Pope Julius II commissioned Raphael to come to Rome to the Vatican Palace to paint frescoes. The most famous of these is the image you're looking at here. This is the School of Athens, 1510 to 1511, and it is also a fresco. This takes up an entire wall in the room known as the Stanza della Signatura, which translates to the room of the signature. This was a room in which most important papal documents would be signed. What you see in here is you see respect for the ancient Greeks. Look at the structure. You can also see Roman influences that we see through the barrel vaults and the coffering in the ceilings. But if you look at the two large statues, one on the left of the arch, one on the right, the image on the left is Apollo, the Greek god for the truth, music, and poetry. To the right, we have Athena, the goddess of wisdom and reason. The various men in the work represent different scholars, most of them from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. For example, the two central figures that we see framed by the arches, the one on the left is Plato. He is the older-looking gentleman pointing up. The idea behind him pointing up is that he is referring to his idea of the ideal forms, that this perfection exists on a plane somewhere other than in reality. Some actually claim that Plato is painted to look like Leonardo da Vinci. So this is Raphael paying respect to one of the great artists of the time. Next to Plato, we see Aristotle. Aristotle is pointing down. Aristotle was more concerned with the material reality and not as much with the ideal forms on the other plane as Plato was. And Aristotle is also holding his text, the Ethics, which concerns with human behavior on earth. We can see the figure sprawled on the steps is supposed to be Socrates. Socrates is known for the Socratic method, meaning questioning. The one thing that Socrates said that he knew was that he did not know. In the lower left, you can see Pythagoras. Pythagoras was a great mathematician. He was known for the Pythagorean theorem. Remember, a squared plus b squared equals c squared? That was Pythagoras. And here on this image, you can see some of these individuals are labeled. On the right, we have Ptolemy, who was Roman. He was a mathematician, geographer, and astronomer. He actually has his back to us, but you can see on the far right that he is holding a globe. Euclid is directly to Ptolemy's left. He's the one bent over, and he is the Greek father of geometry. And you can see he has a slate and a compass in his hand. Then we have Heraclides, who is almost in the center. Take from Socrates, which on this image they have it as Dionysus. Most people believe this is Socrates. However, look at that front central figure in the foreground. The image of the man leaning on the small block, and he is drawing. Well, this is supposed to be the Greek philosopher. However, Raphael created it. It is actually Michelangelo. And then Raphael actually put himself in the work. And I'm going to switch back to the other image because you can see it clearer. If you look on the far right, look to Ptolemy, and then look slightly up to the right, you see this figure looking out with the darker hair. That's actually Raphael within the work, and he's peering back out at the viewer. So you can see that Raphael actually put the artists, the great thinkers of the day, in with the great thinkers of the past to show this connection. What's interesting enough is the School of Athens usually gets a lot of attention. However, directly across from it in the Stegna della Signatura is this fresco. This was executed in 1508 to 1509, so it was actually before the School of Athens. And this is the Disputation of the Holy Sacrament, which is the traditional name for what is really the adoration of the sacrament, which is one of the key principles of the church. This is the moment where the bread and the wine is supposed to become the body of Christ. And so we see this here. So what we have here, if you think about it in this room, and remember this is located within the Vatican, within the seat of the Catholic Church, we have the fresco celebrating knowledge and reason directly across from a fresco celebrating the church. So perhaps in this room, what he was trying to do was to get the popes of the time to think about this idea of faith versus reason. The next artist we're going to look at is the third of the great Florentine artists, Michelangelo Buonarroti, which we only usually refer to him as Michelangelo. He was born 1475 and he died in 1564. Michelangelo was also skilled in many areas: painting, architecture that we've already talked about. He was a poet. However, he considered himself a sculptor. And he would say that the figure is imprisoned in the stone, and it's the sculptor that must release it. And he also believed that beauty was found within the imagination. So we're looking at probably one of his most famous sculptures here. This is the David, 1501 to 1504. It is a marble, and it's over 13 feet tall. And what he believed was that he did not create the David, he merely freed the David from the block of marble, that he subtracted what shouldn't be there. And actually this method of execution, meaning how this type of sculpture is made, is called subtraction. When he was commissioned to create the David, it was originally intended to be on top of the Florence Cathedral. However, when it was finished, the powers that be said this was too beautiful, and instead it was placed in the courtyard of the Palazzo Vecchio, which is in front of the main government buildings in Florence. It has now been moved inside. This building is called the Accademia, and a replica of the David stands where it used to out in the courtyard. You can see within this work, again, the high Renaissance ideal of looking back to the ancient Greek images, and we see this balance and the symmetry within the work. The body is in contrapposto, showing half the body is relaxed and half the body is in tension. And again, we see David with no clothes on. The book claims Michelangelo did this so it was not linked to any specific time period. However, he could also just be following the biblical tale, as we talked about in the early Renaissance with Donatello, or Michelangelo very interested in the human body and the human form, and he's showing the perfection of the human form and showing the skill that he has in creating this work. In 1505, Pope Julius II commissioned him to finish the Sistine Chapel, which Pope Sixtus IV had started. Michelangelo was not overjoyed about this. Michelangelo himself, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, well respected and well liked. Michelangelo was not. Michelangelo had a very violent temper, and he was known to have tantrums, to yell at people, and to treat them not very nicely. Because of this, he got a reputation as someone being hard to work with. However, his artworks spoke for themselves, and so he was often commissioned to do works such as the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Now think about this. We've already talked about the Sistine Chapel. We have frescoes on the wall. The chapel itself, the ceiling was blank, and so they wanted this finished. He had to paint this, again it's fresco, he had to paint this either up on scaffolding or scaffolding where he was laying on his back and painting. So think about that. If you're laying on your back and painting right above you, what's any of the extra doing? It's dripping down on your face. And this work wasn't finished until 1512. The ceiling is over 5,800 square feet. And I'm going to go back to this slide for a minute because the link I have here is actually a link from the Vatican, and it's a virtual tour of the entire Sistine Chapel. You can look around, zoom in at all of the artworks there. This image is only a portion of the ceiling because the ceiling itself is rectangular, and if I put the whole work up here, it would be very, very small, very hard to see. Within this work, in the center, we see probably the most famous image from here, and this is the story of creation. This is the moment where God creates Adam. And if you look at God, he actually has Eve underneath his arm. In the Sistine Chapel ceiling, there are 9 scenes from Genesis, 4 from the Old Testament, and various Old Testament prophets. However, we also see ancient pagan sibyls within this, and these were female prophets. Overall, there are 300 figures in the work, many whose meaning is not known. And you can see here, this is a diagram of what is believed to be each image on the work. Again, you can see some that are just grouped together, family, family, family. We don't know who the individuals are. Comparing this to the image I have here, you actually need to flip this diagram upside down. Looking back at this work, one last thing is the illusionary architecture. When we look up at this, it looks like, if you look at the triangular areas, this looks like these are architecture features and that Michelangelo actually painted within them. This is not true. This and the other columns and the capitals that you see are all illusionary architecture. Means it looks like it's architecturally, structurally there. However, they are all painted onto the ceiling. And then Michelangelo was called back to the Vatican in 1536 to paint the Last Judgment. This is also in the Sistine Chapel, but this is one of the far walls. This was commissioned by Pope Clement VII, who was actually dying at the time. And you can see in this, from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, you can see this is much darker. The moment of the Last Judgment is when Christ is sitting, you can see him, a central figure, large central figure, and he is judging. On the bottom left, the dead are being pulled from their graves and being pulled up to be judged by Jesus. Directly to his left, you can see Mary sitting there, and she almost seems to be turning away in horror. Within this work, the idea of proportion is thrown out. These are not proportional figures. The figures are often distorted and twisted. There is no sense of realism. The figures at the top of the work seem to be much bigger than the figures in the bottom. And then if you look at the bottom right, these are the figures that have been damned. They've been judged not worthy to go up to heaven. And again, we see very grotesque figures. We see beasts. You can see Charon there going in his boat, taking the souls of the dead to the underworld. And then what's also interesting within this work is Michelangelo actually included himself. We see the figure of Saint Bartholomew. Look at the Christ figure and then look slightly down diagonally to the right. You see a man looking back at Christ and holding what appears to be flayed skin, which is exactly what it is. Saint Bartholomew was a martyr, and he was said to be martyred by being skinned alive. So here we see him sitting, holding his own skin. The skin, though, is actually a self-portrait of Michelangelo, and this shows his darker outlook at life. This work can be considered a transition into mannerism, which we'll talk about next week. You can also see this darker outlook at life by looking at two different sculptures by Michelangelo. The first would be his Pietà. The Pietà is known as the moment where Christ has been taken down from the cross and Mary is holding his dead body. The first Pietà is actually in St. Peter's Basilica, and it is a beautiful work, and it shows a very, very large Mary lovingly holding her child's dead body. However, there is also a later Pietà that was never finished, which is much, much darker, and you can see more of the anguish on the figures that are in the work. It's not just Mary and the dead Christ, but it's Mary, Christ, Nicodemus, and actually Mary Magdalene are all put in this work. Next, we're going to shift our focus to more of the Northern Renaissance, and here we're going to look at Titian. Titian dates 1488 to 1490, they're not sure when he was born, to 1576. And your book talks about Venice. Venice was a powerful Italian city-state in northern Italy. Venice is surrounded by water, and actually the city itself was built on a lagoon. The temperature there is the weather, it's very hot and it's very humid, meaning it's not a good climate for fresco painting. They just did not last. So what happens in Vienna is that we have a new painting process that is developed. This does still use the oil paints, however they create a glaze, meaning you have very little pigment or color with a lot of the linseed oil. So it's very watery to work with. What happens in this is you get a very thin layer of paint, and they would paint layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of the glazes. And what would happen within this work is it would give the works depth, and it almost made it seem as if they were radiating light. And you can see that in the example I have for you here. This is Titian's Assumption of the Virgin, 1516 to 1518, and it is painted on panel. This is a very large work. It is actually over 22 feet tall and over 11 feet wide. And it's in the Santa Maria Gloriosa de Frei in Venice, Italy. And again, I said this was painted on panel. So this is not a fresco. It was painted on wood. And it has that layer upon layer of glaze. The Assumption of the Virgin is the moment of Mary, when Mary has passed away from her earthly body and she is transcending up to heaven. So we can see a figure up top, perhaps it's supposed to be God. The Virgin is the central image, and then we can see the people on earth almost saying goodbye to her as she's being taken up to heaven. What I want you to pay attention to is pay attention to the golden light from the top. It almost seems to be radiating out from the work. And even this image that I have here is actually distorted. It dulls it a little. But you get this very warm feeling that it almost seems to be glowing. And in fact, the Venetian artists, this idea, it was called the Venetian golden glow because the works seemed to radiate light themselves, and this was created from using that layer after layer of glaze. They have actually x-rayed many of these works, and they could have up to 30 to 40 layers of glaze on them. The next artist that we're going to look at is Hans Holbein the Younger, again part of the Northern Renaissance. 1497 or 98 to 1543. He was German, born in Augsburg, and he became very famous for his portrait work. He was friends with the Dutch humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam, which you can see his portrait of Erasmus in your textbook. And Erasmus was a very well liked, very well respected humanist scholar. And in fact, he gave Hans Holbein the Younger his letters of introduction to the English court. Here, Holbein became, in 1536, he actually became the court painter to Henry VIII, the King of England, who you see pictured here. Henry VIII, you probably know part of his history. He was the English king who often wanted to divest himself of his wives. Why Holbein was also very popular in his portraiture work was because he always made the sitter look dignified. Unlike some of the early Renaissance painters who were more concerned about showing the people how they actually were, Holbein would edit them in a way so that the sitter always looked good, which, when you're the court painter to Henry VIII, this is probably a good idea. The next image that we're going to look at, this is not in your textbook. However, as I said in class, this is one of the most important paintings of the Renaissance. This is called The Ambassadors, 1533, and it is an oil on oak. Here what we are going to see is this was a portrait. Again, it was commissioned by the man on the left, who was actually the French ambassador to England in 1533. To the right stands his friend, who was the Bishop of Lavore, meaning he is a church figure. But what we see within this work, not only do we see two men of the times, two Renaissance men, they are looking directly back out at the viewer, so the excuse me. So the viewer is engaged, that they look at these men not just as objects in a work, but they see them as individuals. And then they're surrounded by the tools of the Renaissance. Looking at the men themselves, we know that they are wealthy. Number one, the painting was commissioned. And number two, look at the clothing, right? The man on the left, again, this is not Henry VIII, but the man on the left, the clothing, very rich, very luxurious. We can see the furs. And even the bishop on the right, the clergyman, his robes, we can tell it's a very thick fabric and also with fur trim. The picture is in the tradition of showing of learned men with their books and instruments. When you look at the objects on the table, these become very important. On the upper shelf, this includes a celestial globe, meaning a globe to look at the heavens, showing exploration and hinting to the ideas of Copernicus. We see a portable sundial and then other various instruments used for understanding the heavens and for measuring time. On the lower shelf, we see the musical instrument that looks like, we would probably liken it to a guitar. This is called a lute. There is a case of flutes, a hymn book, and it's actually interesting enough, it's turned to a hymn that was written by Martin Luther. We see a book of arithmetic, and then a terrestrial globe of land, showing land and exploration. Interesting enough, if you get close enough to it, the center of the globe is actually pointed to Rome, hinting to the idea of Rome as the center of the world. These objects actually represent the 7 liberal arts that provided the basis for Renaissance education: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astrology. These were the tools that were deemed necessary to study the humanities. So these men, by having these tools with them, they're almost saying, hey, look what we have. We know how to use these. We are Renaissance men. We are well-educated men. However, there are certain details in the work that actually reference a darker side. If you look at the lute, the strings on the lute are actually broken. This shows discord and disharmony. The hymn book, again, I mentioned this. This is open to a work written by Martin Luther. Martin Luther, father of the Protestant Reformation, probably the largest split within the church. We are also going to see within the painting, look in the upper left-hand side. If you can look at that, you see a crucifix on the back wall that is almost completely covered up by this heavy drapery. Again, even the room hints of the wealth of these men. This heavy, rich drapery, even the marble inlaid floor, and the tapestry or the rug that the objects sit on is hinting to trade. But again, we see these darker images, that the covered crucifix may be showing that knowledge is eclipsing the church. And then probably most visual is the skull. When you look at this, it's the center and the center foreground of the work, and it looks almost like a smear. This is what's called an anamorphic skull, meaning it's meant to be seen from a specific angle. And the angle it's meant to be seen is if you were coming up on the painting from the right. So if you want to get a closer image of it and see the skull, look at this image as if you were standing to the painting on the right side of it. And the skull should flatten out. What he's doing in this work, Holbein isn't just saying, hey, look at the technical skill I have, right? But he's adding almost another memento mori, an idea that death comes for us all, that it is a sort of warning, that even though we are learned men, we are men of the Renaissance, that we are all still equal, that death is the great equalizer, because none of us can avoid it. And so within this work, celebrating all the ideals of the Renaissance, we still see this darker side, and again, this almost message to be humble, right? And that we have a responsibility and a duty to all others, because at the end, we are all equal. Next, we're going to talk about Katarina van Heim. She is very interesting, 1527 to 28 to around 1566. We're not exactly sure for when she passed away. And she's considered one of the most important women painters of the Renaissance. We did have women artists at this time. However, it was very hard for women to become artists, especially well-known artists. Katarina was specialized in portraiture work, and we can see here, this is actually a self-portrait of herself at the easel painting. And she's actually credited for being the first artist of either gender depicted sitting at an easel. This portrait was created in 1548. And I mentioned it was hard for women to become artists. Why? Because the training for an artist would include both the dissection of cadavers and the study of the nude male form. These were topics that were considered inappropriate for women, and they would not be allowed there. Often, artists, part of their education, would have to apprentice, meaning that they would go and live with an older artist for 4 or 5 years. Most of these older artists were men. Well, it would be completely inappropriate at the time for a woman to go and live with another male who was not her husband or her father. So that's why it was extremely rare for these female artists. In the rare cases that they did make it to some notoriety, usually they had some sort of close relative who was an artist, and that was Hemmingsen's case. Her father, John Saunders von Hemmingsen, was actually also a well-known artist, and he was the one who educated her. Next, we're going to look at Pieter Bruegel the Elder, circa 1525 to 1569. Mainly, he painted within the Brussels area, and what's very interesting about his works is instead of painting holy figures or the aristocrats, the rulers of the time, he focused on peasants and country life in the countryside. And he celebrated this idea of rural living and the everyday life. And you can see that in the image here. This is Harvesters, 1565, and it's an oil on panel. We've seen other landscapes before, but in those work, the human figure seemed to dominate the form. Here, the landscape is no longer just a setting. What happens in this work, the people are actually part of the work itself. They are part of the landscape. And we see the everyday citizens going out and harvesting the field, which would be hard work. You can see over on the right, some of them taking a break. In fact, the central man laying at the bottom of the tree is actually even taking a nap. And so what he's trying to do within these works is show the dignity and the beauty of the everyday. You can also see this in Peasant Wedding, 1566 to 67, also an oil on panel. This painting was in your book. And what this shows, it shows the happy event of a wedding. There is a lot going on in this work, and it's carefully constructed to appear very informal and to draw the viewer into the event. And it's the exact opposite of other portrait artists we've seen, such as Holbein and Hemsen. Finally, we're going to look at Albrecht Durer, 1471 to 1528. He was German, born in Nuremberg. He was a painter, a printer, a writer, a humanist, and a publisher. However, he's probably most well known for his prints. He did create over 100 paintings in his lifetime, but he has over 1,000 drawings in print. And we're looking here at one of his most famous woodcuts. A woodcut is where it's a printing process where you take some sort of block, usually a wooden block, and you cut away what is not to be printed. Think about a rubber stamp. When you ink a rubber stamp, it's the part that sticks up, which is actually printed onto the other surface. This is the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, circa 1497 to 98. This is a woodcut. What's also interesting about Durer is he almost always left a symbol within his artwork. If you look at the bottom center of this, you see what seems to be an A over a D. That was his symbol. It stands for Albrecht Durer, and you would see this in many of his woodcuts and many of his engravings. In the textbook, they show Adam and Eve, and here it's very obvious. There's actually a plaque hanging from the tree that has Durer's name and the date. Durer also used mathematical proportions in his work, but he also dealt with issues of the times, as we can see in the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Again, this is a biblical scene. This is looking at the end times. But he's also reflecting on the religious turmoil of the time. Here in the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, it shows the medieval superstition, but it's also showing the possible fall of the church. If you look at the people that are being trampled by the Four Horsemen, this includes everyday peasants and citizens, but you can also see in the lower left, there is a bishop of the church that is being trampled by the horses. He was very successful. Durer was very successful in his lifetime. He actually became a court painter to the Emperor Maximilian I, who was still the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He then, in his later life, he became so famous that he could run a shop full of people who all worked for him. And he, like Da Vinci, then focused more of his work on theories of measurement and proportions. He was very interested in the anatomy of the human figure, and Durer, in his later years, would actually develop tools to help other artists with perspective drawings. Now let's turn our attention to some of the other genres. The first is architecture. As we've already mentioned before, with the renewed interest in classical Greek and Rome, we see many buildings with the Greek and Roman influence, such as the columns with the Greek capitals, the Roman arches, barrel vaults, and domes within the work. We've already discussed this with St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican or Rome. You can also see this in Donato Bronte's Tempetto, which translates to the Little Temple. This is in your book. Its dates are 1502 to 1511. You can see the influence in the continuous rows of columns with Doric capitals, that is Greek, and the hemispheric dome, which is Roman. However, in the later Renaissance, homes, buildings became a means of showing personal wealth and power. Again, we saw this some in the early Renaissance with the buildings much like the Medici's. However, there was a shift, and instead of trying to build this fortress-like looking object, here we would see architects trying to show the grandeur of the person who could afford it. Probably one of the best examples of this is the image you see here. This is the Chateau of Chambord within Chambord, France. The architect who's given credit for this is Domenico de Cortada, 1519 to 1547. This chateau is one of the most recognizable chateaus in the world because it has a very distinctive French Renaissance architecture. However, it blends French medieval forms within this. This is laid out like a traditional castle. You would have a castle with the large walls with the keep inside. This was actually constructed for King Francis I of France. It's in the Loire Valley, and interesting enough, this was constructed as a hunting lodge for Francis I. He maintained his royal residencies elsewhere. Within this work, there's many interesting elements. On the top, in the top center, you can actually see this area. You could walk along this, and it contained an entire small village. You would walk along these little cobbled streets and be an entire little village. The chateau itself has 440 rooms, 84 staircases, and probably one of its most prominent features is the open double staircase, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner. This has a double staircase. It's spiraled around, and it actually spanned 3 floors. You have 2 levels. These 2 levels never met. So as you're looking at it here, the person on the bottom level, you can just see somebody on the top level. That little speck of red is someone's shirt. These 2 people are actually on different staircases. They would never meet each other. This building actually took 28 years to construct. And you can see within this, the idea of this is just grandeur, it's opulence. It's to show the power of the individual who could afford to have this built. And again, this was his hunting lodge. Now let's briefly focus on music. Music was still mostly desired for the church service, and we'll focus on 2 composers that follow this idea. The first is Josquin des Prez. 1440 to 1521. He was called the father of musicians and was considered one of the best composers of his time. In fact, he composed about 200 works. And what he would do is he would compose very complex works for church services. Often his works would have overlapping voices that gave the work more body and more texture. And the clip you have here is from the Ave Maria, probably his most famous work. Please listen to this for a few minutes and you can hear the depth and the richness of the work itself. Now the next composer that we're going to look at is Palestrina. He composed works, his ideas were almost the exact opposite of Desprez. What happened is that you then had the idea that the church was spending too much money, that these works were becoming too opulent, too grand. And so there then became a desire to simplify the Mass and the music that went with it, and that is what he did. He returned to the Gregorian roots, which are the Gregorian chants, usually very monotone, that were very traditional church music. You can hear this from his Pope Marcellus Mass, which was written in honor of Pope Marcellus. Again, there is a YouTube clip. Please go and listen to this for a few minutes, and then you can compare the 2. You can see the grandeur of Desprez compared to the very traditional, very basic ideas of Palestrina. Finally, we're going to look at the literature of the time. As I've mentioned before, with the invention of the printing press, written works were more easily produced and were made to be cheaper, so more people could afford them. One of the most famous writers of the time is Castiglione, 1478 to 1529. And he was actually a courtier in the Italian ducal courts. A courtier is the upper classes. These were individuals who would spend much of their life in the court of the dukes or the kings. And they were expected to behave in very precise ways. And what Castiglione did in the book of the courtier it was almost a how-to book, of what a courtier should do and how they should act. It focuses on also the proper ideas of etiquette for the court and includes many ideas. The courtier should be educated in many areas. They should show courage with experience in war. They should be learned in the classics and classical languages. And they should be a servant of the prince or the ruler. They should be physically and emotionally strong. They should be an elegant and witty speaker and an active listener. And they were also required to be a graceful dancer, an elegant singer, and musician. Basically, Castiglione is saying this is the ideal Renaissance man of the time. And if you can encapsulate all of these ideas, you can be a successful courtier. Another author of this time was Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527. He was also educated in the humanist tradition. He is most famous for his work The Prince, written in 1513 and published in 1532 after his death. What this work focuses on, it's a treatise on how a prince, meaning whoever is in power, can and should remain in power. It is a very dark and a very brutal work. In fact, he tells those who are of power that to stay in power, it is better to be feared than to be loved, and that having absolute power is how you stay in power. Those who oppose you must be eliminated. However, he does state that the people can't hate you so much that they revolt against you and overthrow you, yet they should fear you. Many scholars actually argue whether Machiavelli himself was Machiavellian, whether he wanted people to follow these ideals, because usually rulers who follow these ideals are more concerned with staying in power and not about the humanist tradition or the humanist spirit we've been talking about. Again, this was not published until after Machiavelli's death. Interesting enough, it was the most widely read book of the time after the Bible, and it's still read in colleges and universities today. Finally, we're going to look at probably the most famous author of this time period, William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616. He is the most well-known author of the era, probably of all time, but he's usually considered more Elizabethan than Renaissance. He wrote 37 plays and 154 sonnets in his lifetime. The images that you see here are of the Globe Theater. Is burned down, it was rebuilt, and then the image on the right is actually a computer-generated image of what the globe looked like. This was a much smaller theater than would be seen in ancient Greece or in ancient Rome, which offered a much more intimate experience. His plays took more on of a nationalistic flair, again due to the separation of church and state that had been started by Henry VIII, and then in the Elizabethan time period we have this continue. The first plays were in the 1590s, and the last plays were about 1610 and 1611. These plays are usually in three main areas: comedies, such as Much Ado About Nothing, A Midsummer's Night's Dream. These comedies actually include things such as mistaken identity and some sort of confusion, or otherworldly creatures playing tricks on humans. We also see the tragedies, which are probably the most famous of his works, including Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, and probably the greatest work is Hamlet, which was first performed in 1601. In these works, they look back at the ancient Greek tragedies, because usually our hero has some sort of personality flaw that leads to his own destruction and the destruction of those around him. For example, in Othello, Othello's jealousy leads to his own downfall. And then finally we have the histories. These were dramas about events that actually did occur between 1200 and about 1550. But what happens in these is that he makes them more, think of a movie today that's based on actual events. And so he takes these actual events and he changes them into something more for entertainment. This includes King John, Richard II, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, Henry V, Richard III, Henry VIII, and so on. Within them, Shakespeare has such an appeal because you can see this Renaissance idea of humanism in them, and that we see these ideas of humanism, nationalism, and the emotional pull of the work. Again, the language also has this musical quality and dramatic quality about it. Here there is a clip from Hamlet, and this is probably the most famous speech from Hamlet. This is Hamlet's soliloquy, which means speaking one's thoughts aloud. It's from David Tennant as the actor, and it's by the BBC Royal Shakespeare Film. Please take a moment and watch this. And then that concludes our lecture on the High Renaissance.